Shalom and greetings, VFI News supporters and anyone else watching this report. Israelis were celebrating the biblical feast of Shavuot this past week and were also in shock amidst reports of another anti-Semitic attack in the United States and more that have even been planned and thwarted. The war against Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, and all the other proxies of Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps also continues. And there's also a no pun intended bombshell report by the International Atomic Energy Agency about Iran. All that and much more is just ahead on this week's edition of VFI News from Israel. Let's start this week's report by talking about Shavuot, the biblical feast that Israelis celebrated this past week. The word Shavuot is just the plural of Shavua, which means week. In Exodus chapter 34, verse 22, it says, "And you shall observe the feast of weeks, of the first fruits of wheat harvest, and the feast of ingathering at the year's end." A few verses to Exodus 34:26, which tells us, "The first of the first fruits of your land you shall bring to the house of the Lord your God." There's a bit more, but this first part is specifically about Shavuot, so we'll leave it aside for now. Well, Shavuot is one of the Lord's appointed times, a specific date on the calendar that God sets apart as holy unto Him, when His people who are called by His name are commanded to meet with Him. Now, from these passages, we can clearly see that the overall purpose of this appointed meeting time was to offer sacrifices of the first fruits of the spring harvest to God. This would make the children of Israel stand out from their neighbors who would rather not sacrifice this particular crop because at about the time they were harvesting it, they would be eating the last of the previous year's crops. Those last few months before harvest time, they'd be anxiously watching as the stores of wheat got lower and lower, hoping they'd have enough to make it to the new harvest. Now, in the ancient world, famine was an ongoing concern, and it's becoming like that again in modern times. It's not the focus of this report, but if you want to know how to pray into this issue, just do a Google News search for the phrases crop failures and food insecurity, and you'll quickly have all the material you need. Here in Israel, there are hundreds of thousands of people who are not getting enough to eat, and we'll talk about that more later. But it's important to understand this point because otherwise we won't appreciate how much faith it required these ancient Israelites to take that first round of harvesting and instead of eating it, sacrificing it to the Lord. He wanted them to do that because it was a visible, tangible sign that they trusted Him to provide for their needs. In Israel today, there is no traditional seed time and harvest time, and that was in biblical times. But there is something that's comparable to it, and that's the pay cycle. Israelis get their paychecks once a month, usually between the first day of the month and the 10th day. Now, for many people, the last few days of every calendar month are reminiscent of the last few weeks of winter for those ancient Israelites, only instead of counting measures of flour, we're counting shekels. When the paycheck comes, the last thing most people would want to do is give 10% of it as a tithe to their congregation or even more as an offering to a ministry organization. But that's the modern version of the principle that Shavuot teaches us. I know there are some people who say that tithing is not biblical, but nothing could be further from the truth. And besides that, God owns everything about you. And Shavuot is just the proof of that. Furthermore, Yeshua said in Matthew chapter 6, verse 21, "For where your treasure is, there your heart will also be." Now, God doesn't need your money, but He does want your heart. The Bible talks about money more than any other single subject that I know of, believe it or not. And this simple yet profound statement by Yeshua tells us the reason why. God doesn't need or want our money, but He does want 100% of our hearts. And the way we show Him that we trust Him is by giving Him our tithes and offerings as an expression of our love and devotion to Him and our faith in His promise to care for us and provide for our needs. Pretty simple. That's the true meaning of Shavuot. I know there are other meanings, but that is a true principle. And it's a principle that you can find repeated in the New Testament as well. So there's a verse from my mentor, Derek Prince, he was fond of quoting, and that's James 1:27. "Pure and undefiled religion before God and the Father is this, to visit orphans and widows in their trouble and to keep oneself unspotted from the world." Amen. We have a lot of widows and orphans in Israel today, friends. as we've lost hundreds of soldiers in this war so sadly, and many civilians have been lost to terror attacks in recent years. We've also got a lot of single mothers who might now be technically widows, but they're still in a very difficult situation because the father of their children isn't in the picture. Many other families are intact, but they're under a lot of financial pressure as the economy is in bad shape and probably won't be getting much better anytime soon for the general population. For all of these reasons, Vision for Israel is continuing to provide material to support to hundreds of families and individuals who need our help. The needs are many, and they just seem to be growing and growing. I believe that the needs will continue to grow exponentially because there is every indication that large numbers of Jewish people from Europe and North America will be making Aliyah. They'll be immigrating to the land of Israel in the coming months and years. We'll talk about that much more later in the report, but the bottom line is the work of Vision for Israel is more crucial than ever before, and we need your help to make it all happen more than ever before. So please watch this short video about some of the ways we're trying to be a blessing in this difficult time in Israel. We all know that since October 7th, 2023, Israel has faced really tremendous challenges, not only because of the death and destruction that happened along the southern border of Israel in many of our communities, but also across the northern border, to where at one point we had over 100,000 Israeli residents and citizens, both Jews and Arabs alike, who had to evacuate their homes. So it's been a very multi-layered challenge in order to meet the needs of the people of Israel. And that's where Vision for Israel has come to the forefront, networking together across the country with as many others as possible in order to meet the needs of people. And this is all from both security concerns to safety concerns to welfare concerns to even to the children who have lost their education and schooling. Well, welcome back, friends, and now we're going to move on to the reasons I believe we're on the brink of a massive wave of Aliyah from Western countries. It all comes down to one thing, and that's anti-Semitism. Since the October 7, 2023 attacks on Israel by terrorist organization Hamas, there has been an enormous increase in anti-Semitic attitudes and incidents all over the Western world. On Monday, a street demonstration in the United States state of Colorado meant to show solidarity with Israeli hostages being held in Gaza was attacked by a man shouting "Free Palestine" and throwing Molotov cocktails while also using a crude flamethrower. He wounded several people. It's estimated 12 of them, many of them severely burned, including an elderly Holocaust survivor before police overpowered him. He was an Egyptian illegal alien in the United States who had overstayed his visa time. He could get over 600 years in prison. Now, last week I reported about the double murder of Yaron Leshinsky and his girlfriend Sarah Milgram as they left an event hosted by the American Jewish Committee in Washington, D.C. Their murderer also shouted "Free Palestine" and candidly told police as they arrested them that he had carried out this act of terrorism for Gaza. By the way, if you didn't see that video, it's because there was something about it YouTube didn't like, so it's kind of like gotten buried. Only a few hundred people saw it, but you can find it in the archives of our YouTube channel. But in that report, I said I didn't think that would be the last act of violence suffered by the American Jewish community and other supporters of Israel, and I am sad but not surprised to have been proven right. I will say it again, and I hope I'm wrong this time, that this will not be the last time we see Jews and or their supporters of Israel violently attacked in the United States, in the United Kingdom, Canada, and elsewhere in other Western countries. It has already happened several times in Europe, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand over recent years, and this is a trend that is almost certainly here to stay. And by the way, just recently in my home state of Michigan, where I was born, there was a terrorist who was ready to attack a Jewish kindergarten or daycare nursery center. The mind-boggling increase in anti-Semitic posts on social media, which was where most younger people get their news and information about the world these days, make this almost inevitable. That is why I believe we're going to see a surge in Aliyah from Western countries in the months and years to come. There is already a sharp increase, and I will tell you very candidly, friends, Israel is not ready for it. There was already a shortage of housing, schools, health clinics, roads, stores, jobs, and everything else people need before this relatively small surge in Aliyah that began. In Jerusalem and many other cities, building crews are working from sunup to sundown 6 days a week to try and increase the supply of all these things, but it's not enough to meet the demand. Because there is a shortage of supply and rising demand, the price of what is available is only going in one direction. You know what that means. Several friends of mine who have lived in Jerusalem for decades have had to leave the city in the last few years because the cost of living there is just simply too high. Some of them moved to settlement communities in Judea and Samaria, what much of the world calls the West Bank. Well, let's not use that term anymore if we have to. That's a trend that also doesn't show any signs of slowing down, for better or for worse. Ariel, which is the largest city in Samaria, you need to visit it, has more than quadrupled in size over the past 10 years and has gone from being a satellite community of Tel Aviv to practically being a suburb of it. Anyone who still has a fantasy about Israel evacuating the quote-unquote West Bank or the biblical heartland of Israel should go to Ariel and just spend an hour or two looking around. It's Judea and Samaria, by the way, biblical terms. You'll quickly see how absurd it is to think that this is a serious option anymore, if ever there was. All of that is to say, friends, once again, the people of Israel need a lot of help to manage the challenges they face. Here at Vision for Israel, we're doing everything we can to help as many people as we can, and if you want to know more about how you can be part of it, visit our website, visionforisrael.com, and click on the Projects tab. While you're there, be sure to sign up to receive our regular prayer letter and ministry updates. The need has never been greater, and the opportunities to be a blessing have also never been greater. Now, the most obvious reason that the needs have never been greater is, of course, the ongoing war. This week, we passed over 600 days, the mark since the October 7th, 2023 attack by Hamas, which started this war, which was followed by Hezbollah. It is far the longest continuous conflict which we've ever had here. The costs keep adding up along with the strain on families, the economy, the political process, the IDF, and just in general, everything and everybody. The government issued reports recently warning of the strengthening possibility that many social services will see cuts in the next budget. And as I already told you earlier in the report, many families are already right now on razor's edge. The IDF is also showing signs of strain, with reports surfacing of reservists being called up despite having been diagnosed with battle fatigue, PTSD, and other psychological issues. Some reservists have been called up several times over the past 600 days, and there are growing calls for the pool of potential recruits to be expanded by drafting the ultra-Orthodox young men who have traditionally received deferments. This is an old issue that just never seems to go away, and right at this very moment, the parties in the governing coalition that represent the ultra-Orthodox community are once again threatening to force new elections by bolting the coalition. If I was them, I wouldn't be so quick to do that, as the polls are showing that the next election is unlikely to result in a governing coalition that would want them to be part of it. That's all speculative, and a lot can change between now and the next election, whenever it ends up happening. But still, I think the ultra-Orthodox parties are very much mistaken if they think they can continue ignoring the trends in Israeli society, which point to a huge drop in support for the draft deferments for young ultra-Orthodox men. I expect to be reporting on this issue regularly for the foreseeable future, and we might have something new to tell you about it even as soon as next week. Like I said, it's a long-standing issue, but pressure has been building for some kind of resolution as more and more IDF reservists say they just can't go back for any more tours of duty. Be that as it may, Operation Gideon's Chariots, the large-scale offensive to try and free the hostages and defeat Hamas once and for all, is proceeding ahead. Alongside this military operation is an effort to distribute humanitarian aid to Gazan residents without allowing Hamas to steal the aid that is sent into the Strip by the international community so that they can use it to control the population. Hamas, of course, doesn't like this one bit, and they're doing everything they can to try and dissuade the population from going to the distribution centers that are guarded by the IDF and run by an American company called the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. This includes spreading rumors about people being arrested when they come to the distribution centers, being fired upon by the IDF or the GHF guards and or the IDF, whatever I said. On Sunday morning, an incident occurred at one of the distribution points that left dozens of Palestinians dead and many more wounded. Hamas immediately claimed, without citing any evidence, that the IDF tanks had opened fire on crowds as they arrived at the center to try and get something to eat. And this accusation was almost immediately reported by major news outlets, including the BBC and CNN all over the world. In the hours that followed, the IDF published evidence, including drone footage taken at the scene, which repudiated these false accusations, but the damage was already done. You know how it goes. This exact scenario has played out so many times in this war that I don't believe anymore that it's a coincidence or a misunderstanding. There are people working for these international media outlets who are unapologetically anti-Israel, and they do everything they can to make us look bad without any regard whatsoever for the truth. Now, this kind of irresponsible and biased reporting is partially responsible for the surge in anti-Semitism I talked about earlier in the report, and I'll say it one more time, I don't expect this situation to get better anytime soon. As a footnote to all of this, the UN and several NGOs, which have been shouting from the rooftops for months about the humanitarian crisis in Gaza, are refusing to cooperate with this Israeli initiative. They say that on the one hand, they have not seen any evidence that Hamas is stealing humanitarian aid, which is impossible unless they simply don't want to see it. On the other hand, they claim that allowing the IDF to be involved in aid distribution allows Israel to use it as a tool for compelling those civilians to move away from active combat zones and towards designated safe zones. They say this with a perfectly straight face, as if that would be the worst thing in the world if these civilians moved away from the areas where the IDF is fighting Hamas and towards areas where there wasn't any fighting going on. It's almost as if they kind of like the way Hamas uses the civilians as human shields because they know that makes it harder for the IDF to defeat them, and they don't want Hamas defeated. Yes, friends, it's almost like on some level these groups are on Hamas's side in this conflict, or at least strongly not on Israel's side. Shame on those NGOs and the United Nothings or United Nations. Now, meanwhile, there is a flotilla of boats that's reportedly sailing towards Gaza to try and break the blockade. Greta Thunberg, who is famous for being famous, and a handful of other people who are famous for their roles in different TV shows and such, are on the boats, which are reportedly carrying around the same amount of food and medicine that you'd expect to find in a handful of the trucks that Israel sends into the Strip every day. But the point Greta and her friends are trying to make there has nothing to do with reality. It's all about trying to put on a show that will make Israel look bad. They don't really care about the people of Gaza they say they're trying to reach. If they did, there's all kinds of actual ways and steps they could take instead of putting on a stunt like this, which is bound to fail just as so many before it have done. Now, moving on, Israel continues to hit operatives of the Hezbollah terrorist organization in Lebanon with airstrikes, while the Lebanese National Army is impressively stepping up and taking their country back, including the area between the Litani River and the Israeli border. So please join me in praying for the success of the Lebanese National Army and government, which are doing things we've been hoping they'd do for decades that are very much in Israel's interests. Next door, Israel is holding quiet talks with al-Jolani regime in Syria aimed at pursuing a mutually beneficial path forward that could change very quickly. Al-Jolani has had to make many promises to many different factions to keep his coalition together. And if he is unable to keep any of these commitments, or if he lets his guard down even for a moment, he could be very quickly out of the picture, and then we'll have a whole new ballgame in Syria. Perhaps because of this, less than half of the people who evacuated the Galilee communities on October 8th of 2023 have returned to their homes, although there is hope that this number will substantially increase after the current school year ends in July. At that time, all the families with children who are in some kind of educational framework somewhere else in the country and are staying put until this academic year ends will go back to their homes and start rebuilding their communities. Anyways, that is the hope. But candidly, I've been up there and seen some of these communities, and I can tell you that many of them are in very bad shape. And we're just placing another 10 bomb safety shelters up in Kiryat Shmona on the northern border of Israel next to Lebanon. Hezbollah mindlessly fired dozens of weapons into these communities at almost point-blank range, destroying houses, schools, and anything else they could just because it was there. Residents of the northern communities are hesitating to go back to what's left of these communities and begin the rebuilding process for a few different reasons, and that includes the shortage of adequate sheltered spaces in case the rockets and missiles start flying again. When a shelter gets set up in a neighborhood, on a street, in front of a school or community center, or even just at a bus stop, that's often the first step in the process of that community coming back to life. So here at Vision for Israel, we've been placing portable bomb safety shelters in communities over Israel for years. And in the last 600 days plus of this war, the pace has increased dramatically. But there's a lot of places that need a shelter. So please watch this short video about Vision for Israel's project to place bomb safety shelters in Israeli communities. Vision for Israel has been installing bomb safety shelters since actually around the fall of 2021. During that year, there was a barrage of rockets that came into southern Israel, particularly by the terrorist group known as Hamas, and Israel had to find a way further in order to protect its citizens, its residents across the southern part of Israel. And so we sprung into action. We felt like this was a project that we had a personal invitation to fulfill. And it's important because when these projectiles, these missiles, these rockets, whatever that is that's thrown at Israel by its enemies, there is not only the potential for somebody being killed instantly, but also there's tremendous collateral damage and people that get wounded even from shrapnel. And so if you place a safety shelter at a bus stop, or in front of a high school or community center or a kindergarten or any kind of facility that's publicly accessible, the people can run into these shelters. The children can run and find safety in them and be protected from a rocket that lands and shrapnel is scattered, which could be mortally wounding people. So it gives not only a physical protection of security, but also an emotional sense of security that you know having a shelter that you can run to in the street, outside of a store, somewhere publicly accessible, not just in someone's home, but out in the open, gives a sense of security. And I always believe that it's important for us to refer to Scripture and Psalm 91, the whole chapter talks about God providing us a shelter. And we have seen amazing deliverances from enemy rockets as a result. And now we've installed over 400 shelters across the southern and northern borders of Israel. And they weigh 30,000 kilos each, or that's 30 tons. And it's a lot of weight on rebar and concrete that's been specially mixed, and also with a special metal ramp that allows physically impaired people to be able to come up in a walker or a wheelchair on a moment's notice. In many of these areas, residents don't have any longer than between 5 seconds to maximum 45 seconds to get into a shelter to be protected. Welcome back, and please keep the message you just heard in mind, because there's two more stories that really drive home the importance of bomb safety shelters in Israel. The first is an old story about the Houthis in Yemen, who have continued firing ballistic missiles at Israel, including another one on Monday evening. Millions of people heard sirens alerting them to go into bomb shelters, although this missile, like many more before it, was intercepted successfully. However, it's still important to enter a protected space when you hear a siren, because even intercepted missiles create debris and shrapnel, which can be dangerous for people on the ground. But the biggest danger from incoming weapons fired at Israel remains Iran. And on Saturday, the International Atomic Energy Agency published a report giving details of past activities that Iran engaged in that have no other purpose than nuclear weapons development. The report also said that Iran has now enriched enough uranium to 60% purity so that if they took the next relatively short step of enriching it to 90% purity, they'd have enough material to make 10 nuclear bombs. This report prompted Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu to issue a statement on the Shabbat, a highly unusual step for an Israeli Prime Minister to take. The statement spoke of the increased danger posed by Iran and the inevitable conclusion that Iran must be stopped as soon as possible with no more fooling around. People, listen in the nations, no more fooling around. Time has run out. I'm paraphrasing slightly, but you get the point. Now, this report makes it even more likely that Israel will soon launch an attack on Iran's nuclear facilities, with or without American assistance or approval. It is impossible to predict everything that might happen next, but the Ayatollah regime is sure to respond with ballistic missile attacks on us, just as they did in the past in 2024. But we've been reliably informed that Iran has held back some of its most powerful and sophisticated weapons, and Israel would face them in a counterattack to any move we make against Iran. I have no doubt about Israel's ability to withstand such an attack, but it's an open question how much damage we could sustain ourselves. Now, I want to continue the tradition of ending these reports with some good news. So here it is. U.S. Ambassador to Israel Mike Huckabee told Fox News last week that a proposal by France to unilaterally recognize a Palestinian state was highly inappropriate, and that if France wants to create a Palestinian state, they should carve out a section of their own territory in the French Riviera. Wow! And put such a state there. I love this guy, and I'm glad he's America's ambassador to Israel. Until next week, friends, I'm Barry Siegel, and this has been another edition of VFI News from Israel. God bless you and shalom.